All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the final panel in our Native Foodpreneurs and Food Sovereignty Movement series. Once again, for our Cherokee viewers, Osio Nagadawu, Galeele Gaji Jadoa. I'm Courtney Lewis. I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. I'm also the current Andrew W. Mellon Visiting Professor of Justice, Equality, and Community in Anthropology at Davidson College. I am also an assistant professor at the Department of Anthropology and the Institute for Southern Studies at the University of South Carolina, specifically working in economic development. I would like to begin by expressing my sincerest thank you once again to our panel guests for their flexibility in moving our panel online. And also to the support network here at Davidson who made this panel possible, including Ebony Stubbs, Amy Elkins, Daniel Linz, Sundi Richard, Ashley Eep, Winnie Newton, and finally, my esteemed co-organizer, Dr. Rose Stremlau. Before we begin, I would like to encourage all of our audience members to visit our webpage, where you will find a link to help you research and acknowledge the Indigenous land that you are on. So today we're excited to bring you the Agriculture and Activism panel, which has been made possible by the Justice, Equality, and Community Initiative at Davidson College and generously funded by the Mellon Foundation. This panel features Dr. Elizabeth Hoover, Dr. Clint Carroll, and Rue George Warren. It focuses on researchers and community members who are deeply involved in the growth of native foods, the reclamation of these agricultural foodways, as well as the promotion of the food sovereignty movement. I'll begin by briefly introducing each panelist. That will be followed by their own introduction of what they're currently working on. After that, we will move to a discussion between the panelists. And then finally, we will take questions through the YouTube chat window. And feel free to type these questions along the way. You do not have to wait until the end to post your questions. You do need to log in to post questions, but you can remain anonymous. If you feel comfortable, though, please do let us know your name, where you're located, and if you're a student, if you're faculty or staff, alumni, or community member, we'd love to know who is participating and who's watching right now. So I will begin with Dr. Elizabeth Hoover. Dr. Hoover is an associate professor of American Studies, and she teaches courses on environmental health and justice in Native communities, Indigenous food movements, Native American museum curation, and community engaged research. Her first book, shown here, The River is in Us, Fighting Toxins in a Mohawk Community, which is also linked on our website, is an ethnographic exploration of the Akwesasne Mohawks' response to Superfund contamination and environmental health research. Her second book, From Garden Warriors to Good Seeds, Indigenizing the Local Food Movement, explores Native American farming and gardening projects around the country, the success and challenges faced by these organizations, and the ways in which participants define and envision concepts such as food sovereignty and the importance of heritage seeds. This book is forthcoming. Dr. Hoover has also co-edited this book, Indigenous Food Sovereignty in the United States, Restoring Cultural Knowledge, Protecting Environment, and Regaining Health, along with Devin Mehezwa. And again, please find links to these books on our website. So I will turn this over just briefly to Dr. Hoover. Can you tell us, give us just an introduction of what you're currently working on this summer, even if it may be something that is currently being upset by the virus?
Because what is predictable in life? Well, people still have to eat. That is predictable, I guess. So hello, Sego. My name is Elizabeth Hoover. As Courtney mentioned, I'm an associate professor of American Studies at Brown University, where I'm also the faculty chair of the Native American Indigenous Studies Initiative. And then I also work with the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance, which is a grassroots community-based organization. And actually the new website is now up and running. So that's nativefoodalliance.org. So we've been having a lot of Zoom meetings, phone meetings, trying to figure out what are some of the current food needs in Indian country. So, at the same time that everybody else has been panicking and stockpiling food and trying to figure out what the coming growing season is going to look like, Native communities have also been trying to figure out what does this mean? How do we now support people who have suddenly become much more interested in gardening, who have suddenly decided like, oh, what happens when those shelves on the grocery store can no longer provide for you? So the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance has been trying to figure out how to support those kind of projects. The Indigenous Seed Keepers Network, directed by Rowan White, who's a Mohawk seed keeper, has been working diligently to get together seed packets to go out to people, thinking about creating webinars and other educational materials to try to help people who have suddenly gained this interest in becoming gardeners and farmers and food providers for themselves, their families, their communities. And then also just thinking about how you take all this work to the web, like we are all here now. So one of the events that the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance helps to co-sponsor and support each year are some of the different food summits, like the Great Lakes Intertribal Food Summit. And so right now, Dan Cornelius and others are working on trying to figure out how to take that online and thinking about, what are some different panels and programs we can sponsor that would move what would otherwise have been a hands-on type of event, in-person event like the gatherings we're having here. So that's some of the ways things have shifted. So I am supposed to be working on this book right now that Courtney mentioned, From Garden Warriors to Good Seeds, Indigenizing the Local Food Movement. And that's based on all the different communities that I've had the opportunity to visit and interact with through the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance and through years worth of traveling around and visiting with different communities. And so in that upcoming book, there's a chapter on how do communities define food sovereignty? So that's going to look a little different for different community-based projects and different tribal food programs. There's a chapter on what is the role of chefs in the native food movement and thinking about, different efforts of revitalizing and getting people excited about traditional heirloom foods. And now people trying to figure out how to do that at a time when a lot of chefs are out of work. There's a chapter on heirloom seeds and seed rematriation projects. So thinking about how to get seeds back from different institutions who collected them from Native communities and getting them back into people's gardens and pantries and soup pots. And then a chapter on kind of how the anti-pipeline, anti-extractive movement and the food sovereignty movement has dovetailed in a lot of ways. The way that people are using food sovereignty as a lens for why to resist some of these different projects. So I've been, trying to peck away at that, but also thinking again about how this whole COVID-19 pandemic has impacted people's thinking about food systems. So the Journal of Agriculture and Human Values just put out a call for essays that I just quick sent one in, looking at how different communities, so how the food distribution program on Indian reservations, FDIPR, has been pushing to make these programs more flexible and more localized. So talking to folks like Joe Van Alstyne up at Little Traverse, who's been trying to link the tribe's farm to the FDIPR program and saying, look, how can we make these more localized and more flexible? Feeding projects like Brian Yazzie and the guys in the Gathering Cafe, Linus and Ben out there in Minneapolis, trying to quickly turn around and feed, 100 elders a day who aren't getting to food programs, or the Cheyenne River Youth Project in South Dakota, trying to suddenly figure out how do you feed kids who would have been getting all their meals through schools who are now at home. So just thinking about how communities are responding to these, or what I'm suddenly writing about now.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, thank you so much, Liz. We really appreciate you being here today. I know you're doing a lot of Zoom meetings lately, so thank you so much. And a lot of important points that I'd like to get back to, especially about how we get food into the hands of people. right? So how do we go from agriculture into an entire food chain that ties in with issues of accessibility, right? So I'll put a pin in that right before I mention that we're moving to Dr. Clint Carroll. So our next panelist, Dr. Clint Carroll, is an associate professor of ethnic studies at the University of Colorado Boulder. He is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. He works closely with the Cherokee people in Oklahoma on issues of land conservation and the perpetuation of land-based knowledge and ways of life. His book, which I will show here, The Roots of Our Renewal, Ethnobotany and Cherokee Environmental Governance, again, also linked on our website, explores how tribal natural resource managers navigate the material and structural conditions of settler colonialism, as well as how recent efforts in cultural revitalization are informing such practices through traditional forms of decision-making and local environmental knowledge. Dr. Carroll has received fellowships from the Ford Foundation, the Udall Foundation, the US EPA, and the National Science Foundation. So Dr. Carroll, can you tell us briefly about your current research and work you're working on this summer?
Sure, absolutely. Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks to Courtney Lewis and Rose Stremlau for having me on this panel. I'm grateful to be here. And just to tell you a little bit about my work, current work and current projects. Current is just kind of a relative term at this point, as you all might imagine. I work very closely with my community in Oklahoma, the Cherokee Nation, with a lot of our knowledge keepers, elders, specifically a small group of elders who call themselves the Cherokee Nation Medicine Keepers. And I've been working with them for the past, I want to say 15 or so years, to revitalize traditional medicinal plant knowledge specifically, but also branching out into our knowledge and use and practice of agriculture, broadly speaking. And so through this course over the year, through the course of the time that I've been working with this group, we've embarked on a number of different projects, one of which resulting in the book that Courtney just showed you, which the royalties, which I see very little in terms of an academic publication, but all the royalties go to the medicine keepers in case you're interested in buying that book. But another project that's resulted in my work with them is a recent grant from the National Science Foundation. And it's a 5-year grant in its scope. And through this program or through this grant, really there's two major kind of tracks, if you will. One is a research track or project, and then the other is an educational project. And today I want to focus mostly on the educational component in the short time that I have, although they're both really integrated in how they address pressing environmental issues in the Cherokee Nation. The big picture for the educational program is really to attempt to produce a cohort or I guess instill in younger generations this sense of leadership or service, community service, and knowledge in environmental issues. And that ranges from both our traditional knowledge and even Western science, as well as environmental policy and some pressing kind of land-based issues or conservation issues. And one of the main things that we've been doing after we recruited the cohort of 5 students, they're all Cherokee from northeastern Oklahoma, mostly locally based. But one of the big things that we're doing through this program is getting younger generations, getting the students out on the land with the medicine keepers to learn about our plants, to learn about our land-based knowledge. What I've noticed in coordinating and collaborating with the medicine keepers about the curriculum for this educational program, which is 3 years long. So we're about a year and a half into the program. It's really, in terms of formalizing it in this way, the first of its kind. So it's very much a pilot program. But what I've noticed in the activities that we've been doing so far, always in consultation and drawing on the hopes and the knowledge of the medicine keepers for where this project goes, is that a lot of it has to do with food. And so we have some impromptu medicine workshops, I guess you could call them that, out on the land. But in terms of our concerted group activities, we started off with making cornbread from scratch and many other dishes, traditional Cherokee dishes that are based with corn. And this was using our heirloom corn that was grown out by our Secretary of Natural Resources Office staff, which is actually featured in Liz's new book on food sovereignty in the chapter by Pat Gwynn. But we used that corn. The students learned how it was grown, the significance of corn in Cherokee culture, and how to shell it from the cob and grind it down and turn that into cornbread. And as I said, other traditional dishes. And so that was really what started off our group activity. And then since that time, last fall, we've met out at attractive land in rural Adair County. And the students learned how to make a traditional dish called kanuchi, which is made from wild harvested hickory nuts. Sometimes people use black walnuts to make that. But it entailed the commissioning of a canon, which is a giant, mortar, and a wooden pestle called an astosti. And the students used that with after being taught by the elders how to break open the shells of the hickory nuts, extract the nut from those shells, and then begin pounding that into a meal of sorts that was eventually shaped into what we call a kanuchi ball, which is about a softball sized ball of nut meal, if you will, that is later boiled into a delicious dish that we usually eat in the fall and winter time. Really comforting, very rich protein based soup, if you will, that we add hominy or rice to kind of fill it in. And so a lot of the work that has come out of this has really signified both cultivated and wild foods, and then really just getting back to land-based activities. And I really find that Leanne Simpson's phrase, Indigenous Resurgence Project, fits what we're doing, or a community-based Indigenous Resurgence Project, in that it's connected to the land, but it's also more than cultural revitalization. It's about regaining or not regaining, but reconnecting to our ancestral teachings, but also hand in hand with that, reacquiring or strategically looking at planning for the reacquisition of tribal lands that have been lost over the course of centuries. And so really the gift of learning with the medicine keepers is the central component of this project. The research component that I'll just mention briefly is about understanding how Cherokee people in the rural areas are navigating checkerboarded landscapes of allotment, really, that impact our access to medicinal plants, food plants, other plants and animals, I should say. And so really it's kind of reckoning with the reality of this kind of fractionated land ownership patterns that Rose actually talks a lot about in her book, in her amazing book. And so that's kind of the gist of what this project is about. And I think that I'll just stop there and wait for the discussion and questions later. Thank you. Well, no.
Great. Widow Clint, and thank you very much again for agreeing to be on the panel and being so flexible with us as we move online. You touched on a couple of things I'd like to come back to, which, as always, when we talk about Indigenous projects, is the issue of land, right? And access to land. And it's something that's been a thread that's run through pretty much all of our panels that we've had so far. And also, you mentioned something, which is the need to make sure that when we're talking to audiences about food sovereignty, that they realize that what we're talking about in an Indigenous context is a more expansive idea of what food is, right? So we don't think of food as just sustenance, but food can also be medicine, right? And the need to bring all of these together. So when we talk about food sovereignty, it's not just the corn that we eat, but also the other plants that we're gathering, how animals fit into this. It's far more expansive than just the Western kind of conception of food, right? So we can get back to that and kind of the need to convey a holistic understanding rather than a Western compartmentalization that most people are more familiar with, right? In order to truly understand the works that you all are doing right now. And I think that's something that our next guest can talk about as well during the discussion. Our final panelist, we're excited to have Deleslyn Rue George Warren, who is a citizen of the Catawba Nation. Rue is a queer artist, researcher, and organizer from the Catawba Nation, whose work ranges from performance to installation art to community education to food sovereignty and language revitalization. From 2017 to 2019, he was the special projects coordinator for the Catawba Cultural Preservation Project, where he facilitated the Catawba Language Project, including developing and programming online digital assets, several food sovereignty initiatives, and other community education projects. Since 2019, he's continued to work for his nation as a consultant on many projects, including language revitalization, food sovereignty, educational sovereignty, cultural healing, teacher training, grant writing, and more. He's performed, lectured, and exhibited throughout the United States, including the Utah Museum of Fine Arts, the College of Charleston, Vanderbilt University, Ithaca College, and more. So Rue, can you tell us just briefly about your current project and focus for the summer? And welcome.
Hello, Tanake niat Deleslyn George Warren, niat nita Rue, yan isware, yan katabare, yaksuna wanda George Warren, tatewana Buck George, yan company sawachahere, hawo Courtney Lewis, hawo Rose Stremlau, hawo Liz, hawo Clint, hawo Manuke katabare, hawo Nungti, hawo Davidson. Hey everyone, my name is Deleslyn George Warren, but everyone's called me Rue, like kangaroo, since before I was born, so please feel free to call me that. I'm a citizen of Catawba Indian Nation. We are the only federally recognized tribe in South Carolina and one of two in North Carolina. We call ourselves the people of the river because we've lived along the Catawba River since the world began. I'm about 1,000 feet from it, where I'm sitting in my house on our Green Earth Reservation right now. I also told you a little bit about what I do. So in Catawba, the word for artist and the word for teacher are the same word, because if you are, for example, a potter, which is our oldest unbroken tradition, you're also de facto a teacher of pottery. And so a lot of what I focus on is how to think about education as an art form and art as an education form, and how we can keep those two things together and not try and separate them out. I also gave thanks to everyone who's made this possible. Also giving thanks to Davidson for hosting us. And Davidson is on traditional Catawba land. So I guess I also want to say, welcome, Davidson. It's nice to have you here. So what are we working on? So back in 2000, my background is in operatic performance, so nothing related to food sovereignty. But in 2017, I received a grant from the Running Strong for American Indian Youth to return to my community. I was living in DC at the time, and work on language revitalization. And as I was learning the language and teaching people the language, just more and more and more, I saw how tied the language is to land and to plants. And I would see these words for the things that surround us all the time and have no idea what they were, which kind of started my journey into food sovereignty. The following fall, my aunt who runs our cultural center said, okay, you're basically in charge of these 50 garden beds. And I was like, okay, last time I gardened was when I was 8 with my grandpa, and my only memory of it is having to pull up what felt like miles and miles of potatoes in the hot summer. So that kind of started my journey back into food sovereignty. When I started talking about this with people in my community, I realized everyone's already working on this. We had our senior center with their gardens and their feeding programs. We have our wellness program, which does physical exercise and also gardening programs, and then our cultural center, which worked a lot on traditional plants, but we weren't spending a lot of time sitting together and talking about how all these things integrate, kind of like what Clinton was talking about. We're not sitting in silos. Our work is much like the ecosystem we live in. It's all interconnected. So since starting that, there's been a couple different projects that we've started on, and those are continuing right now. Even amidst COVID, the weather doesn't wait for COVID to go away. Still have to get planting. So one of the things we realized really quickly is that the word, the term native plants wasn't very useful for us, because at some point, most of these plants that we use came here. For example, corn. At one point, corn came to our community, and our ancestors said, "Wow, this is great. We should grow this." And so instead of thinking in terms of just native plants, we're also trying to think about traditional plants, and also think about what plants are going to serve us as the climate is changing. Resilience doesn't come from figuring out the one crop that's going to save us. It comes from thinking about the multitude of crops that can work together. So one way that we've been doing that is reclaiming our traditional corn. When I started the project, everyone I talked to said, we need to find our corn variety. It hasn't been grown in almost 75 years by our people. And thanks to a partnership with the Extension Office in North Carolina, we identified a variety that had been grown by a family in North Carolina called the Leal family. And the place where they said they had gotten the corn from the Indians, but we were the only Indians nearby. And so we realized, after looking at the number of rows and all this stuff, that this is a descendant of our corn. So this will be the second year that we are growing it. I just planted out 2 long rows today, which is part of the reason I'm looking disheveled. Another project we're looking at is protecting the plants that really do need protecting. So behind me in this backdrop, you can see the Schweinitz sunflower, Helianthus schweinitzi, which is the only endangered sunflower species in North America. And when you look at its growth patterns, it follows very closely to where our traditional lands are. And in fact, the places that we've had control over the longest are the places where you find the most populations of the sunflower. Through a partnership with the Fish and Wildlife Service, we're attempting to replant it back on our reservation, because we have no population on our current reservation, and then manage it through burning, realizing that that's why it was so common in the past. And also realizing that if we want to take care of these plants, we have to institute rituals of care, namely through burning. And the other great thing about this sunflower is it has edible tubers. So through this partnership with the Fish and Wildlife Service, we're actually going to be able to get to the point where we can do limited cultural harvesting of the plant, which we suspect will actually aid its growth and not hinder it. The last thing that I'm working on right now that I'm really excited about is I just planted out, I think, 30 different varieties of squash, specifically Cucurbita moscato, because we have horrific squash vine borers here. And for the last 100 or so years, squash development has tended towards the bushing variety, which allows for industry to harvest in a really economical way. But it also means that the plant is surviving on one set of roots. And so when this vine borer gets into the stalk, it completely destroys it. And so last summer, we tried a few different varieties of the giant vining squashes, which industry tends to not like, but that did amazingly well despite some horrible vine borer infestations. So my hope this summer is that we can try a bunch of those different large vining varieties and see if we can't mix up the seeds so that we can develop our next generation of traditional seeds. So that's where I am right now. Oh, one other thing I was going to mention, we received a large 5-year grant to continue our food sovereignty work. Our wellness program did. It's called Good Health and Wellness in Indian Country from the CDC. I encourage food workers from tribes to check out that grant. It's really great, even if the application is a little bit of a pain. and through that, we are going to be able to hire a full-time food sovereignty coordinator, which I am deeply grateful for. And the part that I'm most excited about is we're also going to be able to do some paid internships, what we're calling food sovereignty fellows. And through this, we're hoping to support our young people who may not be going to college or who maybe dropped out of high school. Because when they do, the only opportunities around here are places like McDonald's and Walmart. And instead, we want to see if we can redirect their labor towards helping their community get food and also teaching them skills that we think are really important for survivance. So yeah, I think that's everything.
Great, thank you so much, Rue, and thank you for being on the panel. Your comments bring up a few points that I think we can talk to. One is that when we talk about food sovereignty, of course, all of the impacts go into other areas, like how does this economically support our community? How does food sovereignty get utilized to help employment, to help community service, right? But one thing that I'd like to start out with is the challenges that we face, right? So we can talk about the individual challenges that you see in your communities, but also all of these challenges have these deeper structural issues, right? So when we talk about the issue with the squash borer, we're also talking about climate change, right? And we're talking about how can we reclaim our agricultures when our growing zones are slowly shifting, right? So when we talk about the difficulty in reclaiming these, we've got, these problems that are kind of on the surface, but also I'd like to talk about the kind of structural issues that we're fighting right now and the ways that you see that we can kind of tackle those structural issues while we're tackling the day-to-day of how do we get rid of the squash borer, right? So at this time, you can unmute your mics if you'd like to speak, and we'll start out with some of the challenges that you all are facing, and how you see resolution coming from these.
So briefly for me, I think the biggest challenge that we're facing is the theft of our traditional knowledge, and not even for the use of other people, but just through the boarding school system for people who are from tribes from farther west. We've had this experience since the 1500s of slowly being surrounded, and in that being forced into assimilation in a pretty unique way on the East Coast, I think, than elsewhere, and in that process losing a lot of our traditional knowledge. And part of that is shame, because there is also this idea that once it's lost, it can't be reclaimed. And I think that goes also to the idea that the only way to be an authentic Indian is to look like what people expected you to look like 500 years ago. But we're taking an approach to it of saying, well, look, the earth taught us all these things in the first place. We can learn it again. And we can learn from people in other communities who are doing great work. And if they're willing to share that knowledge, sharing it with us, and then just making sure that once we regain that knowledge, either from the earth or from others, that we are instituting in a structural way that knowledge is being passed on to everyone in our community. A lot of time we talk about intergenerational transfer of knowledge, but we also got to make sure that the people who are alive right now are gaining that knowledge and have easy access to it. For us, that means that the biggest barrier for that education is our school system. All of our children are going to public school, and they are there almost all week. When they get to our programs in the after school, we got to give them snack. We got to make them do their homework. Otherwise they get in trouble and we get in trouble. And then after that, we're not going to make them sit and listen or go and learn. They need to go and run around because they don't get to do that in school. And so while they're busy learning a lot of things that may not actually be that useful for them, or just spending a lot of time being forced into compliance, we could be teaching them all these things through the land. So I guess that would be kind of the biggest structural problem for us in teaching our next generation is the school system we're tied up in.
Mhm. And that ties in with a lot of what Clint is doing at this time, right? So the bringing in of interns, the connecting of elders with younger folks and working on the land. Do you see some similarities there?
Were you asking me, Courtney?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Sorry, I'll point randomly. And
The one at the top left, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I was jotting down a whole bunch of stuff as Rue was talking. Going back to your question, just kind of highlighting structural issues, what popped into my mind was a great opportunity to talk not only about climate change, but coinciding with Rue's comments, just kind of what are the origins of these climatic issues that we're confronting today. And I'm teaching a graduate seminar this semester, and today we'll be talking later on about an article written by Zoe Todd and Heather Davis that really challenges this term, the Anthropocene, or this new kind of geologic, this name for a new geologic era that is defined by human impacts, negative human impacts on climate and the environment. And the way that they challenge this term, in their words, decolonize this term, is really pointing back to some of the two main sources of where we find ourselves today. The first one being colonialism, and then the second one really kind of its twin, capitalism, or you could talk about imperialism in the same way. And so kind of highlighting these fundamental structures that have been really drivers of removal and dispossession for indigenous peoples the world over. And when I was thinking about how these structures are impeding efforts to revitalize knowledge and land-based practices, absolutely, as Rue was saying, we've experienced loss of knowledge, loss of land, and what does it mean to reclaim that in the present, specifically with regard to tribal conservation, land conservation projects that may have some immediate benefits, but what does it mean in the case of the Cherokee Nation for nations who straddle kind of these ecoregions? We see these kind of annual decreases of precipitation, and therefore kind of plants that are either shifting their habitats or just kind of not being able to grow where they once have grown. And so it really kind of calls into question, how do we counteract this? How do we react to this? How do we strategize in ways that accounts for these changes that, as Pat Gwynn, one of my co-conspirators, if you will, at Cherokee Nation says, we're being removed from our traditional plants, but we're staying put because we're fixed in our allotment lands, our trust lands are fixed boundaries now, and we see these plants shifting, or we see these habitats either shifting or completely disappearing. And one of the ways, and I'll just kind of talk briefly about this, we are still asking these questions of, again, how, in addition to fractionated land base or fractionated lands, how are Cherokee people navigating this additional layer of climate change? But then looking further east and these kind of openings in policy and with other agencies, governmental agencies. So one in particular, the National Park Service, has a relatively new rule that allows federally recognized tribes to establish agreements with specific parks for gathering within the park boundaries. And it really is a landmark shift in the way that conservation is done and seen in the eyes of the US government, in the eyes of the American public, and that these were originally kind of acts of dispossession and acts of kind of separating the human, the people, from nature, and dispossessing indigenous peoples in the process, and kind of declaring that the best way to, quote, preserve nature is to leave it alone. when in fact indigenous peoples had been living with the land and are other than human relatives in these really amazing and you could say symbiotic, but also just kind of relational ways that improved the ecosystems in which we relied on. And so it's recognizing that, and the Cherokee Nation was approached by the National Park Service to establish an agreement with Buffalo National River, which is to the east of our nation in Arkansas. Coincidentally, well, not so coincidentally, but it turns out that these were also lands that Cherokee people had inhabited for quite some time, even before the forced removal that people know as the Trail of Tears, or as Cherokee people refer to it, the Trail Where We Cried. And so it's kind of reestablishing relationships with former treaty lands that date back to the 1800s. And so we look at this kind of effort to, okay, I guess you could say diversify our approach to climate change, to restricted access to land. Let's look at, again, these openings that policy provides and really kind of go for a strategy that incorporates reestablishing relationships to lands that may have more viable, ironically, I should say, plant populations. It's this kind of, I guess, fortunate but strange paradox of the National Park Service having this history of dispossessing Native peoples from land, but at the same time, over the course of a century, realizing that these boundaries have more or less protected certain plants within them. And so to see this kind of open up as a possibility for Native people to harvest plants within those boundaries now is a promising way to reestablish and even kind of strategize thinking ahead for future climate impacts.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something that the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians in North Carolina have been recently, I say recently, within the past about 8 years wrestling with themselves, is the over-harvesting of non-natives of native plants, which then shut down everybody's harvesting in the national park. And then, of course, the reestablishing and reconnecting with the national park, the importance of supporting Cherokee foodways and food practices of harvesting, which had been pushed to the side. So nobody even considered the fact that Cherokees had sustainable harvesting methods for tens of thousands of years that were kind of being ignored in this conversation. So this year, actually just last month, marks the first year since the court cases came up that the Eastern Band could harvest Sochan again in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. There was only 34 permits issued this year. The Eastern Band have about 15,000 citizens, but it's a step, right? And acknowledging these sustainable traditional ecological knowledge practices is part of this movement, right? And so so I'll move to Liz. Do you see some similarities going on with the challenges that you're working on right now?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I thought of when you said what are some of the challenges are, these kind of twin evils that Clinton has brought up. That how do these capitalist systems work, or how do people work within, whether they kind of like it or not? And that's something that has come up a lot with seed keepers is, okay, so people don't want to sell these seeds that they see as relatives, but then also how do you support seed farmers and seed keepers? And this is something that people have gone around and around in, that people still have to pay their bills. They still have to pay their cell phone bill and their electric bill. And so how do you, at one point in time, people were supported by their community members. So people who had specialties, whether they were medicine people or hunters or, growers, people took care of each other in different ways. And so how to translate that now? When I went and, stopped into 40 different communities and asked people what are some of the biggest challenges for some of these community-based growing projects, a big part of it was funding. So, Rue has talked about the CDC funding. Thinking about how do you, people have said, well, you live by the grant, you die by the grant, but how do you get youth involved if you can't pay them some kind of stipend? How do you, buy the equipment that you need, because not everybody wants to be out there with a digging stick if you can do it with a tractor. And so I think that's been something that people have been trying to think around, is how do you support these food producers? How do you keep some of these varieties going within an economic system that's sort of antithetical to the way that people have been relating? And I just want to say, I think when Rue was talking earlier, one of my favorite things that he said was developing the next generation of traditional seeds. And I just love that framework of thinking about, so not just how do we, get a hold of these seeds and hang on so tight and keep them exactly the way they were, which is also something that Pat Gwynn wrote about in the chapter that Clint was referring to in the book. Like, what does it mean if they start to look a little different than when we got them out of this seed bank? But as Rue was saying, like, how do we develop the seeds that work for us right now in the same way that grandmothers at one point were selecting for seeds that were doing the best in that particular environment at that time, and still having them be special and particular to your community or your family. So that was just a lot of rambling, but that's
No, that is not rambling. I mean, it's the same issue that Native peoples face representationally, right? Which is that, and not just Native peoples, but you have the core of your culture, but also we change, right? That's why we're still here, is because we are at our very hearts changeable and adaptable, right? So do we want to put that kind of baggage of freezing these seeds in this bottle to always remain the same? Do we want to put that kind of representational baggage on our seeds that we ourselves fight every day, right? So I think that's a really interesting point to bring up about how we go about developing these new foods and new medicines that will actually sustain us, as we, as Clint talked about with Pat Gwynn, talked about this kind of new removal of, they're not removing us from our land anymore, but they're removing the land from us in many ways, right? So what do we need to do to protect ourselves and our foodways, right? And what kind of changes do we need as far as methodologies, right? So what does it mean to teach the next generation how to grow when what we're growing is also changing as well, right? So I guess we have to, or we should address the elephant in the room, which is COVID-19, right?
That looks more like a fuzzy dog in the room, but okay.
Yeah, that would be the featured great Pyrenees of Dr. Stremlau. We can address the puppy later as well. But of course, with all of this, with all of these kind of slow changes that we are tackling at this moment, whether it be working with the federal government on harvesting in national parks, whether it is doing climate change, we also have this moment of a sudden impact right in the spring, right when we need to be out planting and harvesting, right when everything is growing. So we have this moment where things need to be happening right now that we have a shelter in place. So that's impacting our ability to come together as a community and work on these gardens safely. So that's one question I'd like you to all address, is how do you see this in your communities working out? But also there's the issue, and I brought this up at the last panel and I'll bring it up again, of so many people now, not just across the United States, but across the world, but especially here, so many non-Native people who are suddenly discovering gardening, right? And they're discovering wild harvesting, right? And what does that mean for Native peoples? Like, what is the impact of the United States suddenly waking up to gardening and waking up to wild harvesting? How do you all view the impacts that will be coming, not just this summer as people get into this, but the impacts going forward.
And I think I was listening to a webinar the other day where Linda Black Elk and Carlos Baca were talking about indigenous foraging. And one of the things Linda brought up was stop killing everything in your yard and forage the dandelions coming up there. Forage the purslane, forage the chickweed. Like there are so many things, weeds that you can be out there eating that are very nutritious for you that won't then endanger populations. Like don't go stomping all over everything to go find the ramps when you've just walked past all of these other edible plants. So I think it's good for people to become interested in edibles, but not just the delicacies that you're gonna, don't just go out and chop down every fiddlehead, but what are some weeds that people have been busy poisoning and eat those.
Yeah, there's definitely a stigma around weeds, right? So this is just as edible as the ramps. And yet this is what we poison, and which is the thing that grows everywhere that seems to continuously supply us with leaves. But the fad is the ramps, right? Very slow growing, takes 10 years to get an actual patch together and sustainable. So yeah, breaking through the stigma of what is not only edible, but what is good to eat, right?
That's so funny that you mentioned that, Liz. It just brought up a memory that I had in DC when I was doing my little garden on my tiny little patio in DC that cost, $2,000 a month or whatever. And I remember going by the hardware store and buying some seeds, and then afterwards getting dinner. And when I was at the hardware store, if you've ever walked into a place where they're selling a lot of pesticides, there's just a smell. And I remember, that being terrible. And then going to this fancy schmancy ramen place, and what greens do they put in their ramen but dandelion greens? And it's just mind blowing because I don't know how much money they're spending on that when it's like you're also spending time poisoning these things elsewhere. I don't really have answers to the question on like what we're doing right now, because mostly I'm just running around trying to get things planted. But for folks who are suddenly interested, I think the issue has always been, when it comes to indigenous knowledge, is respect. Because when you look through history, we are constantly offering knowledge because a lot of the time it was given to us freely, and so we want to give it to other people. But it's when those boundaries are crossed and people want more and more and more, and that's kind of the central ethos of capitalism, right? Is the more. But what this moment is bringing up for me is thinking about time scale, because when we think about colonization, that is in terms of the time scales that we're used to thinking about from our communities, from our stories, that is an acute and recent happening, right? And so we've been seeing how this system just doesn't work. But this very tiny, quick thing that's happening, COVID, feels very acute and sudden in a colonial time span. And I think one thing that people are reacting to a lot is seeing like all of these crops that are having to be turned under because there aren't people who can harvest them, potatoes that are being set out to rot. And I think it just highlights very clearly what we've always known, which is that this food system isn't working because the food system isn't about feeding people, it's about making money. And that's just not where, it's not gonna work.
Right, and this goes back to Liz's earlier point about the food supply chain, right? And access, who has access to this food and how do they get access to this food? Absolutely.
Yeah, and I don't know. I don't have any. I have a lot of reactions. I don't have any answers yet to the elephant in the room question. But just to kind of chime in on both of those questions, what all of us in this Zoom room know, and perhaps many out there in the virtual ether, is that pandemics and indigenous peoples are not. We've met before, I should say, and just to acknowledge that what could be, at least for our people, for the Western Hemisphere, could be considered a pandemic, even though the definition technically of pandemic means global. But our world was completely shattered centuries ago during the colonization of the Western Hemisphere. And to acknowledge that that is also related to what we're dealing with today in terms of the implications of colonialism, imperialism, and its relative globalization, and where we find ourselves today, and what we have to react to and be cautious about in order to sustain ourselves and our elders, most specifically, who have been on my mind in a very intense way lately, and just really kind of a constant hum of worry. And folks have contacted me, friends of mine back home, just saying, you know, I'm worried that we're going to lose all of our culture. And that is significant for us as Native people, because, you know, amid the current administration's messaging that, well, which to me implies that some lives are worth more than others, and that includes not only elders who seem to be being disregarded, but also Black and Brown people being disregarded, who are disproportionately impacted by this pandemic. But it's deeply troubling for Indigenous communities, because elders aren't dispensable to us, as we all know. They're sources of culture, they're sources of wisdom and teachings that losing elders, every elder we lose is a deep blow to all of our psyche, if you will, but really kind of thinking about our fluent language speakers, our knowledge keepers, just our grandparents, our elders generally, and the work that I do being kind of absolutely disrupted by that. And I shouldn't really phrase it that way. It's not about the work being disrupted. It's about us acknowledging that there's no way we could continue this amid the situation because of the obvious risk that we would be in committing with regard to our elders' health and safety. And so I just wanted to kind of acknowledge those points, not to say that I have an answer yet. Obviously, we have to weather this, because we're necessarily halting our activities. The Cherokee Nation itself made a bold leadership decision amid the state of Oklahoma being one of the few states who've remained open to various degrees. But to what I see the question as being the hipster question. That's how I read it. And I that's a cynical and kind of tongue-in-cheek way of reacting to it. But as Rue and Liz have already remarked, you know, we see this in terms of Native knowledge extraction. We even see this kind of broadly in the academy, where a lot of folks have been kind of discovering that everything's related, or that that animals can have agency, and that we're all kin. And you know, and these are folks who are saying this and putting new labels on it, like actor network theory, or animal, who knows, animal, what's the word for it? Somebody help me out here. What's that, Liz?
I think people are just calling it animal studies now.
Yeah, animal study, multi-species ethnography.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, but what we see is just this kind of eschewal of Native thought and theory, not only produced by Native intellectuals and academics, but of course always drawing from and coming from our collective Indigenous knowledge, if you will. And so I see this in this process. The question is, are there risks to settler interest in Native foods? I think absolutely there are risks, but it's a matter of process for me, because the acknowledgement that the fads that are benefiting, that the fads that go on within kind of this food culture of you know, learning or rediscovering, so to speak, ramps, or rediscovering pawpaw, fruits, and then inevitably marketing them.
Right.
And that's what really kind of gets under my skin, is that they're benefiting from ongoing colonialism, and then they're benefiting from the marketization of, as Liz was saying, our relatives, our plant relatives, and our foods that are more than just sustenance and nutrients, they're medicine. And so, you know, absolutely there are risks, but I also think that what are the ways that, again, to be cynical and tongue-in-cheek, that hipsters can actually appreciate and quote, rediscover these wild or cultivated foods that acknowledge not only the knowledge where it comes from, the relationships that they're based in, but that also kind of acknowledge the fact that that in the United States and elsewhere, we're living with ongoing settler colonialism. How can you acknowledge that and put that at the forefront of whatever kind of fads that you want to highlight or promote? So I don't know that, again, it's not a very kind of specific answer to that question, but that's what kind of, that's my reaction to it.
I jump in with a really quick story. So for folks who are not growers of food, corn is a very, it needs a lot of nitrogen, right? And so that's where a lot of industrial fertilizers get used across the United States. And I remember this story, and I was just searching for it as you were talking about discovery and extraction, and I found it, and it was from UC Davis, and they, along with a few other universities, came out with a GMO nitrogen fixing corn variety. And the title of this article about it is How Discovery of Nitrogen Fixing Corn Variety Could Take Us a Step Closer. And just that language of discovery of nitrogen fixing corn variety, both in the academic study that came out about it and in this article, you have to scroll almost to the bottom to realize that what they were saying was that they actually went to this community near Oaxaca in Mexico that had been growing this nitrogen fixing corn variety for millennia and took it from them and used that to develop their nitrogen fixing corn. So again, discovery being a euphemism for taking from indigenous communities.
And of course, that's one of the challenges we're facing now as people are rediscovering gardening and scrambling for seeds and trying to be responsible by looking for heirloom varieties and quote unquote native varieties, however they're defining that in their own terms. But of course, the issue is what Clint is saying. It's the compartmentalization of this, right? So you're taking something that's inherently holistic, compartmentalizing it, and then marketing it and selling it, right? So the question is, how do we use this? I hate to get pedagogical about this. How do we use this as a teaching moment, right? How do we share not only the knowledge that we may have about how to go about sustaining yourself, but also things that are broader than that, about seed sharing, about community support, moving away from an accumulation mindset, right, to more of an indigenous mindset, right, of community-based agriculture, right? And going back to what Clint was saying about, you know, this new discovery that academia and the settler colonial society of things like plant agency and animal agency. I said it last week and I will say it again. I'm glad they're starting to catch up to us, but we also need to make sure that they come further, right? Go all the way. Don't just get the heirloom seeds, right? But think about the philosophy around growing heirloom seeds, right? And that actually, let's, since we started discussing this one question, I'm going to go ahead and let our audience know that if they have any questions, please go ahead and put those in the YouTube chat right now. Again, you can remain anonymous if you're comfortable. We'd love to know where you're from, what your connection is. But I'd like to just begin with one question from Yancey that Clint started to answer. This is the Sustainability Director here at Davidson. Panelist, do you see interest in foodways among Native Nation citizens as something that is growing alongside a broader interest in local traditional foods? And I would also throw in the movements like the slow food movement, right? Do you see these things happening parallel? Do you see a lot of crossover going on with this? And I think we've discussed some of the risks to settler interest in native food. So what kind of crossover do you see, and how do we work with this crossover?
I mean, one of the things when I was interviewing community-based farming and gardening projects around the country, one of the things I was asking some of these project directors was to what extent they saw themselves as part of the local food movement or working alongside, because frequently, the local food movement has been critiqued as being monochromatic, let us say,
Right.
So not as inclusive of folks of color and other communities. And I was surprised at the number of projects that were like, no, we've gotten some helpful input, some helpful advice. It's been nice when people come and, want to buy at our farmers markets or want to, support our markets in that way. And so I think there's opportunity.
Right.
Some of the challenges, as Yancey mentioned, I was on a call recently with the Slow Food Turtle Island group, which is a kind of the slow food chapter separate from Slow Food USA and Slow Food Canada and Slow Food Mexico, specifically for Indigenous communities. And Denisa, coming out of Navajo Nation, was saying, well, the problem is, an article went out about all these cool native food products. And then, when her group went to buy those products for the food boxes for the elders, they weren't available because everybody had hoarded up all of the Ramona beans and the Bowen cornmeal and all of the green thread tea and everything else. So there's that balance between being able to support some of these food projects and buying in a sustainable way or supporting in a sustainable way.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I don't have the answer to how to find that balance. But that's something that I think has been being made more apparent through this COVID thing, when people started hoarding and packing their cupboards, that it became really apparent who had the ability to buy in bulk and hoard and who didn't.
Right. And hoarding, especially food, not just toilet paper, but hoarding, especially food, I think it isn't in many ways a COVID issue, right? It's a symptom of underlying mentalities about food. It's a symptom of issues with the supply chain.
Yeah.
And it's a symptom of attitudes towards food, right? And who should have food and who is going to be left out at times when food becomes scarce. As Native peoples, we've had to deal with this regularly, but much of settler colonial society, although certainly not all, but much of settler colonial society has not had to deal with issues this severe, right? Let me see.
Sorry, I was outside and there was a lot of noise, so I've come back inside. Yeah, and going off of that, hoarding and scarcity, and I think a lot of Native communities talk about the dangers of hoarding and incorporate those into stories. I know Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about it in her book Braiding Sweetgrass, and I've heard Winona LaDuke speak about the Wendigo economy. She doesn't call it a capitalist economy. And I'm not going to get into that story because it's not from my community, but people should go and check that out if they're interested.
Absolutely.
But it also makes me think of how scarcity is used. It's not just an outcome, but it's a tool. And we look at things like the theft of the Black Hills in the Dakotas by the government saying that they were going to withhold the rations, which communities there had become to rely on after the armies had killed almost all the bison. And so scarcity is again not just an outcome, but a tool that's used to coerce us and our communities into decisions. And it's also a fundamental need of this economy to instill in us the idea that there's not enough. And when we look back at the land, we see that all of our non-human relatives prefer to deal in abundance than scarcity. So, yeah.
Right. Scarcity is absolutely in our society by design. Right. Let's see. So moving on to a quick question. Let me look at this real quick. Okay, so this is from one of our students, a student who's currently in my class, HD. Thank you for submitting your question. HD says, thank you all for the amazing discussion. Can anyone speak to some of the ways that non-Indigenous people can support efforts for land reclamation from a food justice perspective? So allyship is what we're talking about, specifically with land and food justice movements.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of examples of non-native farm owners dedicating part of their land to the production of native food crops. So for example, the Hudson Valley Farm Hub and Seed Shed in New York have been working with Rowan White and other folks from Akwesasne in planting out Mohawk heirloom seeds there that then go back to Akwesasne for seed and for food. There's been examples of in Nebraska, farm owners deeding land over to the Ponca tribe, for example, where their corn has been planted on, or the Pie Ranch. There's folks there who've been working with the Amamutsan tribe, and so I think there are opportunities for people who are landowners to recognize whose land their farm is on, even if it's been in your family for a few generations. It was taken from someone before it became your farm, and thinking about how can you collaborate with communities often which don't have a lot of land to be growing out their seeds.
Right. And because our legal system is based a lot on possession, and I'm speaking about the US system, and land possession carries a lot of rights with it. One thing that I've seen and that we're pursuing is working with local landowners so that they can write their land or part of their land into their will to go back to tribal communities, which might seem radical, but it's not all that radical. So again, addressing the fundamental issue of the land. But I also think we need to start thinking about land beyond property and what it means to all be working together here on these lands in some of the models that Liz just pointed to.
So we have time. Oh, go ahead, Clint.
Oh, I'll be quick. I would just add onto those two great points, education followed by action, and that HD is already taking a good step by taking Dr. Lewis's class. But you certainly don't have to be a university student to enact, to educate yourself and to enact that education. And I would say more and more, you can actually find all this stuff on the web. Like, they're not easy answers, but at least there are Indigenous folks and Indigenous allies who have written actually handbooks on what does it mean to be a good ally? What does it mean to say decolonize and follow through on that? And so and also Indigenous peoples don't have all the answers too. We are happy to, and our communities writ large are happy to be a part of the conversation. In fact, that should be a major component of any project that proclaims to decolonize. But I think what's lacking are the creative imaginaries and imaginations and then enactments thereof of settler folks as well. And that, of course, just drawing from an informed and educated perspective that recognizes a lot of work that's been produced recently that really kind of interrogates what does it mean to decolonize and how can we move forward in a good way that benefits Indigenous peoples and benefits the land and it benefits other marginalized communities in this place we call the United States, really Turtle Island generally.
Right. And that actually starts to address one of our last questions. We have time for just a couple of last questions. So one question from Christopher Smith asked, what kind of resources, organizations do you recommend for high school age students looking into issues of native foodways? Where should they start if we're talking about educating younger non-native folks? Should they start online? Are there books they can access, places they can visit?
I mean, this book I think is pretty
Right.
approachable even for, I don't
Right.
think it's necessarily geared just toward a college audience. That
Right.
we very intentionally included non-academics, I guess people who don't work in universities. Everybody in here is very smart, but people are working on all different kinds of food producing projects or in kitchens or on farms. And so I don't think it's necessarily a very theoretically dense book. So that's one place people can start and have a look at it. As I mentioned, the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance has a new website, nativefoodalliance.org.
Which is also posted on the YouTube chat link right now.
Great. The I Collective has been putting out webinars. Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance is putting together some webinars. And so those are places that people can start by listening, because maybe you'll get tired of reading at some point. So I think those are some good places to start.
If you're, it sounds like this person might be on Catawba territory. We do lots of educational programs through our cultural center. Obviously, our primary goal is for our community, but we also do public programming all the time. And so if you're working with a group of high schoolers, bring them down to our cultural center and we'll do a program. And then you can also support our cultural center and our work in our community and the food sovereignty work that we're doing. So if you're on Catawba land, get in touch with us. We are happy to do some cool, engaging work with you.
And Rue, I think there's a question specifically for you, and then we'll move to our last couple of questions. Again, this comes from one of my students. Let's see, as Ella says, this question is for Rue specifically, but all panelists feel free to comment. How do you see art intersecting with the food sovereignty movement? What is the role of artists? And she would also love to know how your performance background informs your work on food sovereignty.
When we, again, talking about food sovereignty in an expansive way, the things that plants gift us are not just nutrition and medicine, right? They're aesthetics. I remember taking a class and I was like, oh, what's that plant for? And the teacher was like, beauty. Beauty is an essential need of not just us, but I think our other than human beings as well. Again, Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about, you know, why do asters and goldenrods look so beautiful together, and talks about kind of the scientific inquiry that she went into to figure that out. So I think that beauty is a concern of all of these living things. So art is obviously just our human way of expressing that. And then in terms of performance, I do this piece called Histories, where I talk about my personal history and then also the history of my community. And I talk a lot about the land and the plants and the other than human beings that live on the land. I also do a lot of education work. And again, I think I feel very comfortable educating people because I've had to stand on stage in front of a bunch of people before. I've had to sing and then have my teacher tell me that I sounded like a dying chicken. So I have no fear of performing in front of people. And I think that has really allowed me to be kind of bold in the ways that I educate people. Like we'll be doing a gardening class and I'll teach people a song to help with the gardening and things like that. So that's kind of how I'm integrating performance with food sovereignty work.
Hey. Clint, do I see you coming in for an answer?
This is part of the new normal.
Yeah.
Instead of raising your hand, you just kind of get
Just
closer
kind of lean in, just.
to unmute yourself. I can't really speak to art and performance, but I do want to plug a friend of mine and his brilliant work in digital storytelling. So Joseph Erb has
Friend of
been
mine too.
working on, yes, yeah, a mutual friend / relative, like literally. Yeah. Courtney's brother-in-law. So yeah, when I think about, that question broadly, and I think about the role of art and artists in the time that we're in specifically, but also broadly, food sovereignty, indigenous resurgence, again, kind of going back to Leanne Simpson, who I read with my grad students this semester, and the way that she uses art as inspiration, or draws inspiration from art and artists. And the message that she kind of conveyed or left us with was that, these are our visionaries who are opening up pathways of seeing and knowing and understanding what the future might look like. And so in kind of an interesting kind of twist, Joseph, through his work in digital storytelling,
Right.
he and I were talking, and he was exploring this idea of virtual reality and creating a world in which, a VR world in which we could relate to chestnut trees again as Cherokee
Right.
people. And this is, of course, in light of the chestnut blight in North America. And and so his conversation with me was about, what do you know about chestnuts, and how can you imagine the landscape would have looked before that time, and how can we recreate it? So it's kind of both a forward-looking kind of future, using technology, but then at the same time drawing upon traditional knowledge, drawing upon kind of ancestral memory, if you will, to understand better how to relate to our lands as they once were, and potentially as they could be at some point in the future.
Right.
If
And
you're,
again,
go ahead, Courtney.
No, you go.
I was going to say, and if anyone out there is interested in indigenous virtual reality and technology, I'm on another talk tomorrow from MIT with a bunch of Native women who are mostly working in virtual reality spaces. So that'll be at noon tomorrow, and I have no way of telling you how to get there, but just Google MIT wampum.codes and you should be able to find it.
Okay. And if you send us the link, we can post it on our website. We are happy to post any and all links that you all would like to send. Yeah, the chestnuts is very interesting. I think that also speaks to getting back to a mindset about how we live. There were millions of chestnut trees, right? A mature chestnut could produce 6,000 chestnuts, just one tree, right? So thinking about the state of abundance, right? Thinking about living instead of with a scarcity mentality, an abundance mentality. So it's not just about the plants, it's not just about being in that environment, but really getting back to a different mindset entirely, right? So I will tell Joseph to get on that. Joseph, get on it. We need this right now. And we are wrapping up, so unfortunately we won't have time to get to our final questions, but I just want to acknowledge the questions that have come in. Clint, one of your students, Joshua Yuen Shat, if I pronounced that correctly, asked, what are the implications of promoting Indigenous knowledge in a society that devalues indigeneity? Another question from a student of mine, Ashley. How do you find a balance with educating non-Native folks, but also making sure they're not taking the knowledge for profit? So this is over-harvesting, cultural appropriation. And finally, kind of the a different direction, but a question that I do want to acknowledge before we wrap up, which is from Chuck Sturdivant. Says, taking a look, many of the people who work in food production are indigenous by one conception of the term or another. So either members of indigenous communities in what is now Central America, or people who might be considered racialized as indigenous in Latin American contexts. And the question is, so what about labor in food production? How do we include labor as well as land in our activism? And that's a very big question, and one that I'm not sure that we'll be able to get to today. But I did want to put the question out there because the question of labor is really central to a lot of our discussions, including the basic question, how do we support the people who are actually laboring to produce our food? Again, going back to what Liz had talked about earlier. So I think that that acknowledges, I think that's all of the questions that I've received so far that I need to acknowledge before we wrap up. But once again, I want to say Wado, thank you so much to our panelists for joining us here today. For our audience members, again, please visit the website. We have bios, links to their books, and we will have other links pasted up that we have talked about here. There's some links in the YouTube channels to the web pages that our guests have mentioned, so please do visit that. But again, I'm so happy that you all could join me today, even virtually. I'm sorry I can't give you a hug in person, but it's out there. This is my virtual hug for you all. Thank you so much again, Liz and Clint and Rue, and I hope to see you in person sometime soon, not too soon, but sometime soon. All right, thank you all.
Hello, Courtney. Hello, Rose. Thanks, Clint. Thanks, Liz.
Yeah. Wado, Courtney, Wado, Rose.
Hawa.
Hawa, do the dog go hunty.
Oh, did a dog go hunty?